But no, I'm really glad to be here and to meet all of you. And one of the things that I want to do today is to get us to step back a bit and really look at the big picture. Now, one of the things is I'm fortunate to get you twice because I'm going to be back tomorrow morning. So you should kind of view these talks as step 1 and step 2, not truly independent. Today I want to really look back and talk about what really drives what's going on in the forest, and then tomorrow I want to get into recovery from disturbance and also talk about the difference between ecological recovery and economic recovery, and how we sometimes get very confused when we combine these. I've had the either fortune or misfortune of managing forests in lots of insects. I managed through one of the eastern spruce budworm outbreaks, through a major gypsy moth outbreak. I had a forest where 25% of my basal area died from hemlock woolly adelgid. I came out here and now I have mountain pine beetle. So one could blame all this with me and think the insects just follow me around, but I don't think it's that way. So I want to get started and I want to talk about the big picture, because I think the key thing that you need to focus on, there's the old adage, when you're up to your neck in alligators, it's hard to remember you were trying to drain the swamp. So I want to talk about managing the resource. And right now we're really focused on mountain pine beetle, but there's much bigger things going on. So I'm going to break these into groups. We're going to start really basic, because the most important influences on our forests are things like plate tectonics, large geologic events, large climatic processes, things like ice ages. And you really get reminded of this when you fly from Vancouver and you're looking down at the Rocky Mountains and you're seeing that uplift and you're seeing the striations of where the inland seas have been, and you realize, wow, this is how our forests of today got here. And I want to move into another group, which is sort of large-scale weather, ocean currents, prevailing winds, topography, these mountains. And also some very long-range human processes. Agricultural land abandonment has probably affected the forests of the world more than many other things that are further down this list where we go. Then we start getting closer down to what we have to deal with as manage. Sudden catastrophic disturbances, wind, fire. I'm going to talk a little bit about volcanoes. And yeah, I was also there for the eruption of Mount St. Helens, working in Washington. So, and clear cutting kind of fits into this category. Then we want to get into sort of episodic disturbances, drought and insect outbreaks. Think disturbances that aren't just sudden like a windstorm, but have a longer range impact. And then come down to things like chronic events, pollution deposition. You realize that in parts of southern Ontario, there is more nitrogen that comes from the sky onto the forest every year than most farmers are applying commercially onto their crops. And it's all coming from constant deposition of nitrogen, which in places like Europe has had a huge impact in the way the forests grow and develop. And underneath this is the ongoing everyday process of inter-tree competition and these autogenic processes. So let's go back to the big picture and let's look at the floristic regions. So everything on the green across the top is the whole Arctic. They're the same genera everywhere you go there. Then you have these other regions, so you have the neotropics, which is in red. And then, actually, I get a lot of experience down here at the sub-Antarctic. In fact, in 2 weeks, I'll be down right on the suture zone where I'm working in Argentina. And the thing is, it's so fascinating, is that totally different genera that came from a totally different background. But then when we get down to the bottom of that list, in terms of autogenic processes and disturbance, the same processes are going on, even though we're in total green. But that whole green area is the same genera wherever we go. So how did this happen? Well, this is the plate tectonics. It's continental drift. So when we look at where the continents were in these various periods, and we get down to between 250 million years ago and 135 million years ago. That's when North America broke off. That's why we have the same genera. And of course, what went on right there was one of the biggest of the 5 mass extinctions, and that's what really set. These are the genera we have that later came in to the species we have. So the table was set for mountain pine beetle 200 million years ago. It's just been kind of coming together since then. Okay, let's go into the short term now and just talk about the last 15,000 years. So in the last 15,000 years, this was the ice sheet. Now, it wasn't as nice and neat as that line shows. You know, there were mountain things going on. There's places that weren't glaciated and so forth. This movement, massive movement of soil and the changing of the bedrock and soil characteristics has also set the site factors that affects wet sites, dry sites, whether we're on glacial till, glacial outwash, and so forth. And that has set up where does pine have an advantage over other species. So this was really, we're getting down now to the details of microsite variation, and that was set 10 or 12,000 years ago. Now, this is the Columbia ice field. I'm sure you're all more familiar with this, and I took this just a few years ago. The glacier, the sheet is way up here now. That sign is for 1982, but as many of you in this audience I know, probably like me, when I was a child, it was back up by that parking lot, and now of course it's far to the left. But look at these soil conditions and try in your mind to bring yourself back 10 or 12,000 years ago, but with a major difference. It's warm in this glacial retreat. It was cold when the ice sheet went. So things weren't the same. And that's going to be another theme both today and tomorrow is it's different every time. No matter what disturbance we look at, it's slightly different every time. Now, when you read the fascinating book by Beetle, and it talks about the northern limit of lodgepole pine moved 2,200 kilometers in 12,000 years. So that's 2 kilometers a decade. Now, lodgepole pine had this really nice advantage of no major east-west mountains getting in the way. That's not true around the rest of the world. It's not even true on the coast. So we have species that are still fighting to get over the Siskiyou Mountains between the Oregon and California border. Redwoods grow absolutely fantastically in Vancouver, but they're still trying to get over the Siskiyou Mountains to get north. So when you have an east-west mountain, it starts blocking these things coming up. So then you get jumps. You get episodic movement and migration. Here in Alberta, and we're looking at things like pine, it's a bit more slower, steady gradient. But it's not without bumps in the road, because things like the Little Ice Age come in. Little Ice Age is that period. It's a little hard to tell when it starts up, maybe 250 years ago to 450 years ago, when it was really cold. Now, we don't have the Western written history here in Alberta to talk about the Little Ice Age, but in Eastern Canada and especially Europe, there's a lot of records of what was going on in the Little Ice Age. So when you start looking at old trees that germinated 250 years ago, they were germinating in a completely different climate. So even though we've had some of these steady changes, there's been big dips and warmings and so forth. So you notice in my list, I didn't talk about climate change. And that's because that is totally ingrained in everything that's been happening. Now, past changes in the climates certainly were not due to greenhouse gases and the like of what's happening today. But this idea of shifts is constantly there. This shift is going more rapidly than a lot of the other shifts, but when you look back the last 12,000 years, the ups and downs, some have gone faster than others. So it's more a matter of trying to understand what's happening. So I don't like to just take climate change, which is a major thing we're trying to deal with, and put it as a distinct part of what we have in looking at the big picture, because it's been happening for millions and millions of years. Now here's an example. This is the Nooksack Glacier, which is actually around to the left. This is right on the Washington, BC border. Now, when you look at those trees in the middle, that was the advance during the Little Ice Age. So the mountain glacier came down, and it made terminal moraine, which became those trees. Those trees are about 300 years old. And that effect there is because of the advance that went on the Little Ice Age. That's not very long ago. These things are always happening. Okay, so here is the terminal moraine from 450 years ago. Now, when you start looking, let's think back to the pictures I showed of the Columbia ice field. And you can see that the soil characteristics right there means that we're getting different species here. So this is terminal moraine, this is till, and when you get down here, and on the other side of that, you're getting outwash. So we're getting some very major differences in what species have an advantage. So as we start looking at what's going on there now, the big driving factor in the Nooksack Valley is the Little Ice Age that moved things 450 years ago and started moving soil around. Okay, let's just jump back down to Patagonia now. This is a mountain glacier, and the Tola Glacier would be sort of right on my back if I was standing here now. But I want you to focus in here. You get a really good view of the lateral moraine. So this is another way of looking at what that terminal moraine did. And if we go up a little further, this is the same glacier, and you can see the lateral moraine. And you can see here, there's been a fire. And that fire, I'm sure the intensity of that fire was partially impacted by the soil characteristics of what's there that would have been affected by previous advances of this mountain glacier. And what you see up here, this is Patagonia. That's not mountain pine beetle. It's fall. When I go down in May, the trees are all in color. So those are hardwood trees in Argentina, the Northophagus. But you can see this gradient shift. Now that's not much elevation. A lot of the shift between the evergreens, the Ostrocedrus, and the Northophagus is because of soil characteristic changes. So we tend to be looking at these gradients on landscape and just thinking of environment without putting into context what was set either decades ago, Nooksack hundreds of years ago, or ice fields thousands of years ago. Jumping ahead. Prevailing winds. You know, these are going to shift. They have always been shifting, but for a lot slower shift. So we're talking about thousands of years here. So when you look here, of course, we have the westerlies that are coming across here, and the trade winds coming here. This greatly affects things because obviously, rain shadows and all of the Alberta influence and so forth. When we're talking about climatic change, you got to remember, and I'm going to come back to this again, the mountains aren't moving. There's still going to be a rain shadow going on. The prevailing winds dictate the big climatic differences, the prevailing winds and the topography. The topography is changing very, very slowly. So the prevailing winds drive a lot of what we're seeing. And this is the kind of things, now we're getting into the factors that make studying mountain pine beetle so difficult and so complicated. And you can see, when I'm down in Patagonia, we have the same westerlies. So it looks a lot like Alberta because we have the Andes Mountains right down here. Now, ocean currents. This is kind of driving the whole thing. And when you combine the ocean currents with the prevailing winds, then you go back into the plate tectonics. So the whole Arctic, remember this is all the same genera in this whole area. And then if you combine and look and compare places with the same combination of ocean currents and prevailing winds, you get the same stand structure. Different species, same genera. So the classic one, if you compare northeastern United States with northern Japan, same genera, different species, same stand structure. So you can show people pictures of northern Japan and northeastern United States, and if the camera's not close enough so they can actually pick up species differences in the foliage, you can't tell the difference between the two. So now we're talking about, again, the big driving factors that are going on. So the take home from this are species are still moving north. Most trees are actually very maladapted to their current environment, and that's been going on for thousands and thousands of years. And mountains don't move, at least not very quickly. So that's driving a lot. Okay, let's jump ahead to another category, forest loss. This is your basic UN FAO map of current forest and previous forest. So let's zoom in a little bit. It's going to be fuzzy. It's hard to zoom in on a PDF. And if we look at the color difference there and there, that's basically agriculture that has moved the forest boundary. Agriculture around the world, humans in general around the world, have been the driving force for forest loss and forest change. And you might say, okay, that's old history now. This is last week in the Globe and Mail. And this is showing this concern about afforestation, that companies are coming in and buying agriculture land and growing trees. Now, we've always seen a little bit of that, growing poplars for pulp and short rotations, but this is long rotation. This is afforestation for carbon credits. And we're starting to see the panic. BC Cattlemen's Association saying we're going to run out of hay, and we're getting an NDP critic wanting to introduce a bill saying no afforestation, no carbon sequestration going on. Well, this idea of shifting agriculture everywhere in the world has been going on and on and on for thousands of years. So let's go back to this one. I wish I had a different order. So the two major causes of shifting forest cover are shifts in agriculture and creation of infrastructure. So the forests around Vancouver were cleared for the city. And very recently, Vancouver, we look at cities in the world, Vancouver is an incredibly new city. And when I go out with students in the parks around campus, and I try to say, these were logged, and the logs were brought to a sawmill by oxen 150 years ago, and students have a hard time believing these. We're standing amongst skyscrapers, and you're saying people move these logs. Vancouver is a very, very new city. Okay, I want to just show you, I'm going to focus on this a lot more tomorrow, but I'm going to show the buildup this time. These are dioramas put together for the Harvard Forest in central Massachusetts. And this is the combination of ecologists and artists putting together three-dimensional dioramas of what the forest looked like from one particular place in Massachusetts. So there it was before Western European settlement. There it was in 1740, subsistence farming. 1830, large-scale farming. This area was supplying food to Boston. 1850, people found out you could grow food a lot faster in the prairies, a lot less rocks, and they left. So then, when you look at it today, it looks like this. And you can still see, when you're wandering on those forests, stone walls left over from the subsistence farming. We're going to talk a lot about this more tomorrow when we start talking about recovery. This is short-term history here. We're talking about a very small part of human development. So now let's start focusing. We're getting down more to specific terms. When is a stand destroyed? Often we do way too much averaging. So on this axis I have time, and on this axis I'm going to talk about magnitude of disturbance. Right now we're leaving it whatever disturbance you want to think about. This is very hypothetical. And if you look over time, there'd be variations in the magnitude of whatever disturbance. For the human eye, it's a lot easier to kind of think about this in terms of wind, because a big line means a big winds, strong winds, short lines. So when is the stand destroyed? Well, let's look on this axis, and I'm going to put the hypothetical resistance of the stand, and in this case in wind. So short trees are amazingly resistant to wind. A tree this tall will not blow down in a 200 kilometer mile an hour windstorm. But as the trees get taller, they start breaking down. So when is the stand destroyed? It's right here. But when you look at that disturbance event, it was actually a much smaller disturbance than back there. But the stand resistance. So you got to, you got to be combining all these things now. All these different factors are leading to what changes the resistance of the stand. Now we tend to focus on mountain pine beetle and little things, our management and our fire history and so forth affecting the species composition, the stands, and so forth. That all gets integrated here, but you got to keep the big idea. So when you look at the general patterns of stand development, we have different stages of open, dense, and then they start breaking up and more complex. We have this general pattern we think about. But, and we're getting more and more savannas again. Forest management didn't like this, so we got rid of them all, but now we like it again, so we're putting them all back again with things like variable retention. But you got to remember, any of those at any time, fire, beetle, or whatever, could go back there, and anything could kind of move to savanna. So there's different likelihoods. So now we're getting this idea of low probability events and high probability events. Moving on to another disturbance. I think that in Canada, and we have folks here who know far more than me about this, but I think the best record of episodic insect attack in Canada is eastern spruce budworm, where you can take these different chronologies and show this very consistent. But this is a combination of the population dynamics of the insect and the resistance of the stand. So after spruce budworm, the species composition, it's basically like here, the spruce budworm kills what they need, and then the other things take over. So for a while, the stand is resistant again. So you get this periodicity because of that combination of magnitude of disturbance and resistance of the stand. So now we're getting down to the autogenic. So, the classic one, if you look at a gradient of site conditions, dry, mesic, and wet, so the blue species might have a range like that. Site sensitive, the red species, the classic, what we refer to as site insensitive. This would be things like lodgepole pine, would look like that. So if you just step back and watched it, it means that in that range you'd have the red species, and in the middle range you'd have the blue species. But of course, life isn't that simple, and it wasn't all that long ago that we tried to make it this simple. We worked very hard. There was a development in scientific history, things like niche theory, where fundamental niche was where something could grow, realized niche was where it did grow, and that was assumed because of competition, that if something was a bad competitor, it could grow there, but it got out-competed there. But when we had niche theory, it did not include any concept of disturbance. So we now know we can't use this basic ecological theories anymore. We have to have theories that include the role of disturbance, and we're going to be talking about this a lot more tomorrow, because it includes such things as regeneration mechanisms. This is what you're seeing with mountain pine beetle. What is there as advanced regeneration? What is there that can sprout? That we can't just look at what happens if we get to sort of mid-age stands. And of course it's not symmetric in that nice stylistic one. So one of the places this has been studied quite a bit is in the Rocky Mountains of the United States. So if we just look at ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and Grand fir, and we looked at relative competitiveness, we start seeing that they vary. It's asymmetric. But the important thing is that every species grows best on the best sites. Every species grows best on that moist, well-drained, sandy loam, adequate rain throughout. But that's not where you find them. You find them where they can outcompete the other species and their other neighbors. So what we're seeing then is that if some species disappears, some other species is actually going to jump in and do better. In other words, ponderosa pine in this example isn't found there because it really enjoys those bad sites. Given a chance, it would grow much better on those sites. Now, in forest management, again, we'll talk about this more, we use this to our advantage. by adding resources to the site, we can take advantage of this shift. And the mountain pine beetle is doing some of this for us, but not necessarily in the way we want it to do it in terms of the direction of forest management. So let's delve down into more details. Let's keep that in the background. But even that is averaging and glossing over time. The longest record of daily recorded weather, temperature, and rainfall daily in North America, as far as I know, is New Haven, Connecticut. And if you look at the line, if we just look at precipitation from 1895 to 2000, you see it's all over the place. So if a tree was in that drought, then and things die, then that's going to affect everything that's going on. In other words, you can't be old if you die young, which means if that shift goes on there, as low probability as that event is, that could affect stand structure for 100 years or more. Just that low probability event. But when we've been focusing on niche theory, climax theory, and these things, we're focusing on the long-term averages. But what's really happening when we get down is we almost have to throw, you know, I was out with students in the woods yesterday, and I was kidding, you know, the classic economist joke. We were talking about sampling variation, but the economist shoots an arrow and it misses the target to the left. The economist shoots another arrow and it misses the target to the right, and he jumps up and yells, "Bullseye!" Well, it's the same thing that's going on here. When we start looking at averages, we can miss the whole point. So we got to step back and we got to see the big things, but then we have to bring in the little and the important things that are going on. This is just to show you it's not New Haven, Connecticut. This is a much shorter one. This is precipitation departure from average, averaged over Canada. And even more important, now we can start combining those soil factors which were really developed by the bedrock, the large geologic features like volcanoes and so forth, and the plate tectonics and the glaciers to give us a soil structure. So then we can have the Palmer Drought Stress Index. This is a combination of moisture and the soil conditions. And we can see this doesn't look just like the rainfall. And in any particular stand, the Palmer Drought Stress Index is going to be different. And all you folks managing stands, you know that. That droughts affect some places more than others. So as we start managing after the pine beetle, we have to realize that places are going to react very differently. We have to understand. Now, when I look at this, you see that ends in year 2000. I don't think anybody here would talk about how wet it is now. But this is indicating we're in a very wet period. But of course, for the last 10, 15 years, we've been getting through in some very dry periods. I don't know why Environment Canada makes the dry years blue and the wet years red, but they do that. It seems a little counterintuitive to me. But these wet years are now over. So, okay, where do we stand? Life is a series of high probability events and low probability events. We tend to look at long-term averages based on the high probability events, and the low probability events can really drive what's going on. On average, our forests look like the result of the high probability events and the long-term events, but any specific stand is a result of at least some low probability events. The ecology is very complicated. We have to take out of this patterns. Take a systems approach. Look for emergent properties as we study our stands as a forest system, and start to understand what the emergent patterns are. When we're looking at the emergent patterns, we can't forget the underlying driving factors that will not change. The results of plate tectonics, the results of glacial retreat, the prevailing winds, the ocean currents. And my best example of this, a long time ago when we first started looking at climate change, I had a student and a professor come to me. We're talking about the early 1980s, and they were doing southern pine species in the U.S. migration predicted for what we had then in our models of climate change. And they had slash pine moving north very steadily to Ohio. Well, it's only found in the very south. So I asked them, why do you think slash pine doesn't grow further north? Well, the answer is it gets killed by ice storms. And then I said, as long as the Gulf of Mexico doesn't move and the Appalachian Mountains doesn't move, the range of slash pine isn't going to move unless we jump it way ahead up to Ohio. It doesn't matter whether an ice storm is every 5 years or an ice storm is every 20 years. Slash pine's not moving. So we're going to see a frequency change. So you have to keep those big patterns underneath. So in silviculture, our management activities basically try to make the future stand structure that we desire a high probability. We can't guarantee it. So when we're doing these scenarios tomorrow, how do we make it a higher probability? And our perceptions of resistance and resilience, that's a human context lens. We're going to go into that tomorrow. That we can, to talk that in ecological terms, those are human terms, and we'll discuss that tomorrow. So I just want to end by saying when we look at stands, we must remember that when you add a stand, it's never looked exactly that way before. It'll never look that way again. That's been the truth for over 200 million years.